I'd like to thank the Creator for this beautiful day. Thank the Creator for this beautiful territory that we live in. Ask the Creator to watch over all of our friends and family, all our communities, carry them through these troubled times. Ask the Creator to lay a special blessing on our elders and our infirmed. Give them strength to carry on. Also ask the Creator to give strength to all the people that helped organize this and those that chose to participate. Because this is, the Creator is placing a great work in your hands, a great work to bring forward for Mother Earth. Ask the Creator to watch over each and every one of you from this day forward. Oshim.
Thanks so much, Erik. And I want to invite everyone joining from other places to take a moment to consider and honor the history of stewardship and the cultural heritage of that place. So let's just take a second to think about that.
So if we're going to create a sink through a nature-based climate project, it will need to be stable for 100 years. We'll need to be reaching into the future. And if we do this on Crown land, we're reaching into Aboriginal rights and title. The biotic dynamic of change on our landscapes is really only defined by doing it collectively, by doing it jointly. And there we go. So that safe, and this is our huge advantage as ecologists, as beginning to think from our relationship with nature in a different context. So the leaf stomata, and Briony has this slide with a bit of data, but our natural ecosystems do absorb carbon, the emissions that we have in the atmosphere, and we need to draw those down. There's a project drawdown that looks at all the possible ways to draw down. There have been air mining conferences which are competing for creative ways to grow food or do things that draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but nothing's more efficient than our photosynthetic processes, and or than that great process that the algal community, who are our sea plants, use, and like kelp. And so there is this dynamic relationship, and it's not only carbon dioxide that's absorbed in the stomata, oxygen's released, carbon's brought into the soil and traded for nitrogen with the mycelial community by trees in this case, and many plants. And of course, all the water exchange and the whole dynamic relationship. One of the most compelling things that I have is a NOAA, National Oceans and Atmospheric Administration model of a couple of years of rainfall, and you look at where does all the rain come from in the southern cone in South America, where a great deal of the world's food is grown. The globe has become dependent on all that food, and from Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, that whole region. And all the moisture for that region comes out of the Amazon. And you can see it forming and then streaming south and raining on those southern areas. And that relationship's true in all natural ecosystems. The forests have a high function in exchanging water, but we're talking here about climate. And so what are the foundation principles for having a climate project? In a very simple sense, I'm just showing a period here from 1920 to 2120, a 200-year period. We're here in the middle in 2020 or 2021, but I like round numbers. And so we've got the area in the Salish Sea without the kelp beds that used to have. And in 1920, those kelp beds were already hugely thin from where they were historically. Under Indigenous management and stewardship, the ocean, it was difficult to get to shore in many places, and the kelp beds were a major part of the ocean scape. And however, with all of the sea otters having been decimated by 1920, we're looking at maybe less kelp than is possible today if we rethink things. So in a project, you'll have historic trends, and continuing those trends is your baseline in your model, and your project line in this case may be to simply create kelp beds in a region. And the carbon that's taken out of the ocean in this case, because carbon's being released from the ocean all the time, and carbon's in the ocean, carbon dioxide, pardon me, is in the ocean often in the form of H4CO3, but it is, that's how that kelp prefers to absorb it, also absorbs carbon dioxide, and that is, the kelp tends to distribute itself and end up in the benthic floor and be interred for a long time of the plants that you could grow. It's a very good way to sequester carbon. So you have a project line and a baseline, and the difference is the creditable carbon. There's all kinds of conservative calculations. Robert's going through those details, but there are some foundation contexts for this, because without First Nation leading the project, without a civic Indigenous partnership, at the very least a partnership, we cannot plan what we're going to be doing, especially in Crown forests or land and oceans areas. So the marine and terrestrial projects need that partnership. There needs to be a registry, there needs to be protocols for developing projects, there needs to be a developer who will model your options and look at how to go about this. So these are perhaps projects are if you develop the project, the eligibility of that project is independently audited every 5 years. Is this project real? How far have you achieved your goals? Is also verified with an independent audit, and then whatever credits have really been created become available to the market, and that carries on for the life of the project. For 100 years, there's a 100-year commitment involved. I have a note there that you need integrated landscape planning. That is now a possibility through the province's initiative. We'll talk about that in a minute. So where is there a possibility for this kind of aligned, integrated, Indigenous civic agreement on what both parties want? The Cheakamus Community Forest in Whistler, which is co-managed and owned by Squamish and Lil'wat Nation with the community of Whistler, is a project that we started in 2010. Briony was involved with that. We had a living carbon concept that we worked on together, but that project is today the only improved forest management, which is one of the protocols or methodologies that is available through the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, and looks at what are the things we can do to change how we log, in this case on the left, less clear cuts, as you can see lower down. In the new area of harvest, you can't see where it's been harvested, more selection, but what it's really done is take the Indigenous communities involved and enabled a completely different kind of harvesting. The credits from reducing the harvest area have become, have created funding to do a more intensive selection, careful logging, bigger riparian reserves, and the values that are critical to the Indigenous community are realized through a very different kind of forest management practice. It is a challenge to get Indigenous communities and civic authority, usually the province of British Columbia, because they are under Constitution responsible for our natural resources, and they hoard, they protect that right intensively. We were working in the center. This is the Secwepemcum territory, which is 18 million hectares. You can see in the top corner is Villemont, in the bottom, towards the bottom end from here, you go over to Williams Lake, that area of the province. Some of the big fires occurred there. We were trying to do an integrated landscape management project on behalf of one of the communities with the province, who weren't ready for it. So we said, okay, we'll do some riparian restoration, and the entire area burned in the Elephant Hill fire. But, you know, it was a disaster, but it was also an opportunity to demonstrate some adaptive integrated co-management. So working with 11 of the communities, all Secwepemcum communities that were affected by the Elephant Hill fire, and with the province agreed to what was called the Elephant Hill Joint Leadership Council. The concept was have the leaders get together, the manager for the district and the chiefs or selected leaders from the councils, and let's have a technical table and look at the options and what were we going to manage. Very simply, the morels, the second crisis that follows the fire for Indigenous communities because of the Wild West of cash payments, which are sometimes, pardon me, we discovered payments in cash and drugs. And there's classically an influx of drugs in communities post-fire because of the hundreds. In this fire, we estimate 800 pickers show up from all over the world to pick for the forced food collection folks. We have a company called Forest Food that's been working on changing values on the landscape. So what collectively was decided that each community would select stewards, go into the landscape and control where they pick, stay off the archaeological sites, the environmentally sensitive sites, and go out and help people in trouble, because every year some people are lost. In reality, in past years, previous to 2018, this is in 2018, some people are lost and never found. And not in 2018 in British Columbia, nor subsequently, because we took this model to other fire communities. But the effect for the Indigenous communities, and one of the Cookpies or chiefs, Cookpie Ryan Day, spoke about this very emotionally, openly, his responsibility for, I'll just see if that call is telling me I'm talking too long. No, his responsibility.
Dirk, to be mindful.
How am I doing for time?
Probably wrap it up in the next couple of minutes so Brian, you can take over.
Great, not far from the end. Historically, he had the typical challenges of Indigenous communities and talked about having Aboriginal psychologists, suicide counselors, all of these. How does he deal with the distress that is inherent to the colonization effect on these communities for whom their identity and their culture is the land? And he said during this period of being stewards on the landscape, all of the traditional problems that he had in his community disappeared, and he could not express strongly enough that for us all, realizing that the path of reconciliation is a path back to the landscape and to their traditional territory, and having some agency on that traditional territory. So that challenge of how do you bring Indigenous and civic alignment, we also did a exercise, which I won't go into in great detail, looking at how do you model all of this and bring communities together in a way that you can see they're aligned. We did that on the lower Skeena. The interesting finding was doing a deep dive into those communities and prioritizing their values. They were both water and fish-centric communities, where they hold that at the center of all their values, and they see a water-centric way of thinking about how their landscape works. So without getting into the modeling, the integrated landscape analysis, the cumulative impact analysis, all the kinds of things we did. We did that as a working exercise through the Future Forest Ecosystem Science Council in 2009 to 2013. There is a way to find a way forward in this situation, and that's, Briony, over to you.
Okay, you'll need to unshare.
All right, I stop share, right?
Hi, everybody. Oops. Oh, what's happening? There we go. So this is kind of, Dirk's kind of mapped out some of the carbon projects that really have tried to embrace kind of the overlying concepts. I'm going to be much more mundane and just take you down to some very basic concepts, so that when you hear these words, you'll understand what they're talking about. We started, and I thought the whole, the poster for the conference was this beautiful stomata. And I just wanted to kind of remind people that these are these incredible living organisms that pull carbon dioxide out of the air. Every time I hear about some, another $1 billion being spent on carbon sequestration machines, it just makes me so angry. So it's just really, when you think about 2 trillion of these little stomata and every hectare of Douglas fir forest pulling Douglas fir out, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. These are the kinds of images I want you to keep in your mind about what tremendous potential we have in this coastal Douglas fir region. So what is blue and green carbon? Sometimes it's called living carbon. It just essentially is plants and living things that capture and store carbon. And that can range from all the plants in a forest right down into the eelgrass meadows, the kelp beds, some of these areas that Dirk was referring to. And then what are conservation offsets? Sometimes they're called, offsets can have a variety of different project types, but conservation offsets is sort of the general term that we use, where it's a project that is intending to protect, restore, steward. It's kind of the clunky Western language for trying to protect Mother Nature. And it's a financial tool that was set up by the UN. It was meant only as a transition tool. It's not ideal. Ideally, we would just have a worldview shift, but we're not there yet. And we're still dealing with these very early projects of how to shift from one worldview to another, essentially where you're placing nature as sacred and as important as it is, which we don't. So how do they work? It's essentially a polluters pay principle. Polluters pay for the emissions that they release, and that money goes towards a project. So what Dirk was talking about were projects that carbon emissions made by polluters helped pay for. So these are projects, as he was saying, that would either be a forest or an eelgrass, or that would otherwise have been cut down or has already been cut down and needs to be restored. These these carbon credits are essentially like they are documents that go into exchanges. There's many exchanges around the world. And so the project is there to generate and to sell verified conservation offsets. And that's what generates our revenue. To do that, the carbon has to be conserved, and it in the trees, the soil, the understory. There's all these different carbon pools. You'll hear talk about carbon pools, 6, sometimes 7 pools, separately identified pools. And these are all measured. And this is sometimes part of the cost of what, and the difficulty that we've run into in the past is that these are expensive processes. So for a project, you have to have proof, and this is another part of a project development, that the project is different than business as usual. So for example, if you look on the forest, this area has been protected under some kind of designation or legal document like a conservation covenant or an agreement that is different than what was going to occur normally. So what really spurred a lot of this forum was that we're dealing with, on Salt Spring, for example, we have business as usual is that you can just go in and cut down your forest. There is no regulation to stop clear cutting of forests. So what is it that is different that a project would bring that makes it different than business as usual? So these are all the questions that come up with carbon credits and have to be developed and papered in documents. And then they have to be registered. And they have to be registered under the highest standards, because if you don't have high standards, you don't have a climate bonus, you don't have a biodiversity element, you don't have the cultural integrity that is essential. And we know all these things because under the what's called the Clean Development Mechanism, the UN has been doing these kinds of projects in the tropics for decades. And the very first projects were terrible. They paid no attention to biodiversity and cultural rights and integrity. So we've learned a lot, and now our attentions are being directed to our temperate rainforests and our coastal Douglas fir, because it's also a high carbon storage forest. So the reason that high standards matter is that not only is it a greater atmospheric benefit, but we get a higher return for carbon projects when you have higher standards, when you have co-benefits, and you can prove and document all these things. They also have the insurance on these projects is much lower when you have entire communities that are buying in and supporting them, and that you have respected Indigenous rights and title, that you've respected community values. So the other trigger of all of this is that the federal government has introduced their healthy economy, healthy environment policy, and they're talking about nature-based solutions. This is one element of nature-based solutions, are these carbon projects, and we want to make sure that we're ahead of the game, that we are demanding the highest standards, and that we that they get it right. So I'm just gonna couple more. How's my time, Shauna?
We have 10 minutes left, so if we want to leave some time for questions, and maybe another 5 minutes or so at most.
I'm going to move through these really quickly because these slides are all going to be available to people on the talk. It's much easier to work through these over time, and your bedtime reading, it's pretty boring. But what I want to draw attention to this is that right now it's a diverse market. It's very complicated. People get very confused, and there's a lot of discussion about the pros and cons. But just so you know that there's something called voluntary markets, there's compliance markets, and there's some hybrids. And in the voluntary markets, there's pros and cons for them. They tend to be a bit more flexible. There's a lot of methodologies, what are called methodologies or standards. And they're tried and true. Climate Action Reserve in California, The verified carbon standard has been going for a long time. Then there's compliance markets, and we have a compliance market in the BC Forest Carbon Offset Protocol. The federal forest carbon offset protocols are in development. And then in BC, we also have this kind of funny hybrid in the Green Communities Committee, which, and I won't go into it now, I'll talk about it in the next policy session. And just so everybody knows, on Salt Spring, we've developed a forest infographic that really kind of explains forest carbon and how forests mitigate climate change. So that'll be available. I won't go into it now, but it's just know that it's available for people. And then in terms of Carbon Accounting 101, there's all this language that you'll hear, things like eligibility, additionality, permanence, leakage, baselines, carbon pools. These are all the language of carbon projects, and it's probably similar to the language of computers or combustion engines that we got 20 years ago, 100 years ago. In other jurisdictions, they've simplified these things so that they've become a lot more workable, but we're not there yet in Canada. We need to bring everybody up into the complexity so that we get it right, that we have people involved in this decision making that understand these terms, and that they're making sure that we keep nature, that we keep Indigenous rights, that we keep community values front and center, so that we don't get a kind of watering down of what these nature-based solutions are, because there are so many pit holes to fall in. So I'm just going to really move through these very quickly. In terms of eligibility, there's a lot of variability depending on the different types of standards, and they're very specific to project types. Additionality is a really key term in carbon projects. You need to know that the project would not have been done without revenue from carbon credits. So it can't be just something that, again, is business as usual. So that's the kind of key term. And then the other key term is that the project line has to be additional to the baseline. And you can just think of that picture that Dirk had of the kelp, and then the contemporary non-kelp, and then the baseline is actually shifting that downward trend back to a viable kelp beds again, because people have applied time and stewardship and love and care to these places. This is, again, how you determine the baseline, and it's the likely management practices that you would do. And that all goes into the project. And that's why traditional Indigenous management of these areas is key, because this is where we find the amazing flourishing of these ecosystems was actually with that long-term management. These are just visual examples of what a baseline is, that you're restoring back to specific baselines. These are the pools I talked about, the carbon pools, above ground, below ground, soil. You hear, there's all sorts of different ways of classifying these carbon pools, but that's what they are. And there is another pool called harvested wood products, which I won't go into now, and it can be a bit of a minefield. So we'll leave that for 202. Permanence means how are we going to accommodate all the things that go on in these ecosystems. We have natural disturbances. We also have disturbances like fire that are caused by poor management. So we have to be able to distinguish between poor management and natural disturbances. And that you have to create insurance schemes like buffers or discounts or temporary credits. But what we do know is that when you create legal tools, whether it's conservation covenants or you bring in Indigenous law and governance, you're going to do a much better job for permanence. Leakage means you don't want to shift the problem elsewhere. So if you've protected a forest here or an eelgrass here, is someone just going to move a marina or log somewhere else? You have to ensure that is not going to be a knock-on effect. And finally, you want to be able to value the carbon as it's sequestered, not anticipating you're going to. So these notions where you just plant 2 billion trees, well, it doesn't solve the problem of it's going to take 85 years before these forests have fully stored all of this carbon and are actually at full, starting to be at full carbon sequestration mode. So in best practice is always that you only deal with the carbon as it's sequestered. You don't want to buy future carbons. That's where we went wrong. Okay, so I'm going to end there and open it to questions.
Hey folks, we have about 4 minutes left in this breakout room. So if anybody has any questions, you can probably just take yourself off mute. We only have about 30 people in this room right now, so we could probably have vocal questions without chaos. So if folks want to just pop in and ask any questions.
They can't actually take themselves off mute, Shauna. You need to unmute them. So they need to either raise their hand or do a little thing in the reactions space,
Great.
like this, putting up a finger or something like that to let you.
This is fabulous. Great. Okay, I just gave you a thumbs up. Yeah, so let me know in the chat if you'd like to ask any questions. Oh, Darlene Gage raised a hand. If anybody else has any questions, you can type them into the chat box or you can raise that hand.
Briony, I could make a couple of comments on your presentation. One stuck out for me because the nature-based climate program that the government, the Canadian, the Environment and Climate Change Canada Ministry brought out, they called it they called it Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy. They linked those two, but they have the 2 billion tree program. And yes, if we plant 2 billion trees in the next decade, it'll be a few decades before it's of benefit. But if we don't do that, and if we don't do some things that are adding to the atmospheric greenhouse gas removal terrestrial activities, we'll not get to 2050 and meet our goals. And so we can plan now to meet our goals in 2050. And but yes, those credits, say in 2050, will only enter the National Registry and be important in 2050, or they'll enter it gradually over the period from now to 2050. And so there may be 5-year trades on what you're calling temporary credits, but it is essential. And the fact that we don't get the credits for a while is all about the generational thinking we need to begin doing. We need to do things now that are, we've got to get rid of this notional idea of discounting the future and prioritizing the present. We have to change that. We have to consider that equally important to actions today. But I just wanted to
thanks.
shout out for the program, which I've had a small hand in helping think about. So launch it. But go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted
questions
to
I see.
say that I think people think that it's the only option is to plant trees as opposed to, because right now in British Columbia, we're watching old growth being cut down. It doesn't make any sense. So we really need to be able to have both. I guess that's what I was trying to,
You have 55 seconds. Sorry.
So I will make a comment on old growth because I hate that language personally. It's part of our colonial dismissal of the Indigenous stewardship of the landscape before we showed up.